Now my privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker, a man, at least in Europe, needs very little introduction, the founding CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre for the UK, and now part of the university circuit. I'm delighted to welcome Ciaran to the stage, who's going to open proceedings. Thank you, Ciaran.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming in such terrifying numbers, putting on a terrifyingly high resolution and very large screen. I just back from Berlin, so nobody had a clue who I was. So I do need an introduction in Europe. So let me, I'm going to set the scene about understanding cyber risk, given what we're here to discuss, hopefully a helpful high-level view. But I will introduce myself because most of you will have no idea who I am. So I was the first head of the NCSC in just down the road in Victoria. That's official opening day. The brilliant high-res screens show up the grainy quality of my colleague's photography. So that's the late Queen and His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, who's poring over, that's the departmental historian of GCHQ on the left, poring over a World War II code book, which we thought it'd be great to show him because he was in the Navy during the war. And in very classic Prince Philip style, he said that it was a disaster that nearly got him killed on multiple occasions. He'd hoped he'd never see it again. But the NCSC hopefully turned a corner after that and became a reasonably successful organization that I would encourage you to keep in touch with. So I now teach at the University of Oxford. I do bits of writing. So for example, well, some might not say cyberspace is getting safer anymore, and you'll probably agree with that by the end of the presentation. You know, it makes your mum proud when you get published in The Economist, but perhaps my proudest moment, I thought, was when I was called a cybersecurity ace by a national newspaper. Unfortunately, it was the Daily Star, and there you go. So anyway, that's me. So look, we're going to do four things today, quickly. Understanding threat actors, understanding harm, understanding tech, and understanding network architecture, because hopefully that tees up for the much more expert and specific discussions you've got to come, but it'll certainly set the scene. And then we'll finish with a few takeaways, because, you know, that's why you're here, I hope. And there'll be some time for questions at the end. We are overrunning, but I will try to get you a little bit of the time back. So let's start with these two. You can't really distinguish actors from harm, because they kind of go together. So I'm going to cheat by putting the first two parts of the presentation together. So I'm not going to go into this because it'd take too long and it's a bit sort of academic-y, but when I left government service, I thought, you know what, this cyber thing's a bit weird. There's all sorts of stuff that we group under the big badge of cybersecurity and cyber harms, and it's completely different. What do you want to worry about? So I sort of did a little 3x3 matrix, and it starts with getting robbed in cyberspace. And there's a bunch of things, cash theft. Even cash theft is a very different and diverse range. It could be anything from small amounts of cyber-enabled fraud, where people steal small amounts of money from huge numbers of people, all the way through to the North Koreans doing a bank heist on the Bank of Bangladesh and getting nearly $100 million, but actually, if they hadn't been stopped, getting $1 billion out of it. There's data, there's IP theft. We worry about our intellectual property. We've been complaining for decades about China doing this. Then, of course, there's big data and big illegal data. So those are the sort of things that get us robbed. Then there's a bunch of things that are a bit more, I mean, that's just crime and commercially motivated activity. As it gets a bit more strategic and you get weakened. So there's massive espionage. I mean, just right now, every government spying on loads of people, and private entities as well are being spied on for all sorts of different strategic reasons. Oh, there we go, thank you. These days there's much more by the way of political interference, misinformation, disinformation, trying to use influences in all sorts of different ways. Then there's this little techie thing called pre-positioning. So it's not active yet, but it could be. In other words, you know, cyber's not a conventional weapon. You can't just say, right, I'm going to point at you. Now I've made up with you, I'm going to point it over there. It takes ages to prepare. This is the preparation. This is lurking in the network. So I'll come to a good example later. Now, thus far, we've got getting robbed and getting weakened. And in all of these cases, your network goes on just as normal. It isn't disrupted. You may be hemorrhaging really valuable stuff, but the organization unless there's a specific reason, you've lost money, or somebody tells you you've lost a load of IP, or a criminal gang tries to extort you over your data, you won't actually notice this stuff. In fact, pre-positioning, it's designed that you don't see it, so is espionage. So the network was on fine. They start to get hurt, which is another thing, completely different problem, and much more visible. Think anybody who's gone to a Marks and Spencer's recently, where, there's a spillover. So sometimes, WannaCry, not petty, think back to those horrible 2 weeks in 2017, where first the North Koreans and then the Russians misfired their cyber tools. And all over the world, not petty, it took out Maersk, the shipping company, and a chocolate factory in Tasmania in Australia, even though they were attacking Ukraine. There's dangerously disruptive. I'm somebody who was quite a realist about cyber threats, saying that let's not panic about it. I'm getting very, very worried about the amount of healthcare disruption, where the connection to actual human safety is getting closer. Because there is the potential, although we've seen very little of it, for lethal cyber activity. So I wanted to just get that up, because when you want to understand cyber risk, which bits of those are you most realistically worried about? In other words, is it the scam? Is it Stuxnet? Or is it something in between? And for most people, it'll be a combination of things in between, but they're completely different problems, completely different motivations, and they're completely different threat actors and motives. So, first time I spoke out in public on behalf of the government in 2014, 11 years ago, I warned of, as we all did, Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. Still, it's the same four, the same big four, different motives. Russia's historically been very political. China's been very economic, but that's changing. Come to that in a minute. North Korea was very political, but now it's just basically stealing money to try and survive. And Iran, a massive sort of spying entity with from their point of view, a good sideline in critical infrastructure disruption capabilities. And then there are the criminals. This is a wonderful photograph taken by a BBC journalist of one of the leading ransomware operators in central Moscow, speaking openly to a police officer for a minor traffic offense, and then letting him on his way, despite the fact there's an abundance of evidence that they're responsible for huge amounts of damaging cybercrime all over the world. And this picture is pretty stable. It might change. We'll come on to that later. But it's been pretty stable, and this is why they're doing it. And you think about, on the left, the nation states. Are they after you? Well, some of them might be. On the right, are they after you? Absolutely. They're after anybody with data and money. But then there are things that, the hype merchants, we're always told the cyber threat's getting exponentially worse and everybody's at it. Actually, if you look back at the history of threat warnings, the sort of lone wolf, inevitable, obligatory young male sitting in his bedroom, some damage, but not as much as previously predicted. And cyber terrorism hasn't really caught on. So this was something in 2015 we thought was a cyber terrorist activity from so-called Islamic State when they took over a French TV station in a really technically complicated operation. It turns out it was the Russians. We don't know what they were doing. They were practicing. Why the Russians were pretending to be a bunch of extremists operating out of Syria and Iraq, I have no idea. But but terrorists so far, and hopefully this can continue, but I'm not sure we should bet on it, have not had the stability, the money, the expertise, the infrastructure to be able to keep themselves safe. If you're a stateless terrorist group trying to hide from the US or whoever it is, then it's going to be pretty hard to run a major offensive cyber operation out of it. So understanding that threat, who might be after you and why, is really important. Also, I think one of the most obvious things we miss is where it's coming from. So last year, it wasn't me, but some of my colleagues at the University of Oxford did a really big study on the geography of cybercrime. Here it is. There's the heat map. So it'll be of no surprise that the dark area is Russia. 75% of ransomware comes from Russia. The other areas, there's large parts they didn't cover. As you can see, they didn't look at most of Africa. But the other sort of hotspots, China, Nigeria, Belarus, the United States. Now, what's interesting about that is, with the exception of the United States, possibly Nigeria, but it's a bit more complicated. I mean, the big hotspots are areas where our police can't go. Even if we were on better terms with Putin's Russia than we are, the Russian constitution has an explicit prohibition on extraditing any Russian citizen. So One of the things I think we don't understand in terms of combating cybercrime is that traditional policing, I'm not saying all policing, but traditional policing doesn't work. In traditional crime, has to be done in this country because there's some physical element. You can plot it from abroad. You have to do it here. Cybercrime, you don't. So the whole point about how you can rely on police and so forth to go after the criminals just breaks down. And it's a really obvious point when you think about it, but we don't think about it enough. And that, of course, is something that heightens cyber risk because it means that when you're protecting a physical business, you can say, well, at the end of the day, the police will be on it or the security services will be on it. But on your network, that's not really the case. So that's one of the worrying aspects of cybercrime. There's also, for those of you, because I know some of you will be in strategically important companies from a national security point of view, just something that's changed about China. So China historically has just been the biggest, most gluttonous data thief in history. It could be political data from government or it could be commercial data from companies. And they're still doing that. But this is something I wrote recently, you can look it up if you like, about what we call the typhoons, particularly the operation known as Volt Typhoon that's come out over the past 2 years. Because this is the most significant change in the geopolitical threat picture in years, in my view. Because what it means is China has moved from just being a data thief. Think back to the bottom of the middle column in that taxonomy a few minutes ago. China is preparing to do major cyber disruption, certainly against the US and probably against the US's allies if it needs to. And that is new. If you talk to any Chinese government interlocutors, and I've talked to quite a few, they'll always say three things. One, Taiwan is an integral part of China. I'm not going to comment on that either way. Number two, modern China has never invaded anyone. That is true. Number three, modern China has never done a disruptive cyber operation against another country. That's also true for now. They're preparing it. So, in a bit more detail, China has changed. Cyber is a much more strategic political tool. They're doing the Salt Typhoon. There is a major espionage operation against US telecoms infrastructure. Think of it as the US doing a Snowden to the US. And then on the right, Volt Typhoon is sort of that pre-positioning, that turning of cyber. Some people have called it digital booby traps all over US critical infrastructure. It's a way more sharper, politically useful tool than just the old days of saying, here's some technology, steal it, and we'll give it to a Chinese company. So that's the sort of note on the threat actors and harms. Now, why does all this matter? Sort of covered it a bit, but one of my favorite anecdotes was when a friend of mine who's a vendor, not in the same space as Qualys, just sort of small, very basic, small business facing endpoint protection and things like that. And she went to a company and gave a presentation on the capabilities. And somebody who was new to cybersecurity but had spent a little bit too much time on Google said, but you know, I'm looking at this capability and I don't think it would protect against Stuxnet. And she said, yes, but is your company enriching uranium, right? So it's that point where you have to match the realistic threat that you face to the sort of things that you need. When I was at the National Cybersecurity Center, we issued this report to the legal sector. It's a really good example. It's now been updated, and this is the cover. I just use it as an example of what the advice says. So it's in governmentese, so I'll decode it for you. It says, you know, provincial solicitors, you've got lots of sensitive personal data, and that's basically your liability. That's basically what you should be most worried about. Magic Circle law firms, you've got loads of really interesting IP on behalf of customers, loads of M&A data that'll be of interest to all sorts of people. Oh, by the way, which one of you have got the Russian oligarchs on your books? Because that's a different problem altogether, right? You just need to think about what you're sort of doing. And also, I think we need to think about what we're most worried about. And here, there are all sorts of lessons, but in the interest of time, I'll just use one case from one of the worst cyber attacks of all time, which is the disruption of Irish healthcare in 2021. So this is the Irish Army, along with CrowdStrike and everybody else, piling in to try and restore networks, because as this presentation shows, the day the health service stopped. Now, I find this case absolutely fascinating. Firstly, it sounds like the sort of thing that a nation state would do for political reasons. Nope, it was the Conti group, the Russian ransomware group. Secondly, it was double extortion ransomware. You know what that is. They firstly lock you out of the network, and then they show that they've got some data and they to add to the pressure. Now, like most governments, the Irish state didn't pay. But the impact of this was extraordinary and brutal. So for about 4 days, the Irish Health Services Executive, which is a bit like the commissioning function of the NHS, it sort of says, here's where you're going for your appointment for your operation. It could be to a public hospital, a voluntary charitable hospital, or a private thing. It's a sort of mix in Ireland. But there's a single state-run commissioning system that allocates the appointments, and it went completely down. And the health service stopped. You know, there are a few workarounds for emergencies and so forth, but the impact was absolutely terrible. Cancer diagnostic appointments on average were delayed for about 2.5 months, and for 4 days it was basically nothing at all. On day 4, because the Irish government, as I said, doesn't pay, on day 4, the Conti Group released some medical files just to the government. They didn't put them on the dark web at that point, but just to show they had pressure. What was fascinating for me in terms of understanding cyber risk was about the legal framework, because it was only when they released a small amount of medical files that a regulatory offense was committed, right? So the entire national healthcare system had stopped working, and that wasn't in law a problem. That wasn't a breach of legal duties. A few tidbits of medical files, you're in breach of the law. That's a bit mad to me. And I think sometimes, whether it's corporate governance, whether it's law, we sometimes think about two completely different problems in two completely different ways. We force people to take personal data really seriously, and that's right. But what if, as explicitly in this case, it was to prioritize personal data protection over the ability to actually provide healthcare? If you're sick and you need an operation and you've got the choice of 2 bad options, and you have to pick one of them, one is your operation is going to be cancelled, and the other is your personal data is going to go missing. Many people here are going to go for option 2 over option 1. But that's the way we incentivize organizations. We have to think about cyber risk differently, even though it's quite a hard choice. And of course, just in a commercial sense, this matters too, because I'm chair of something called the Cyber Monitoring Centre's Technical Committee. It's a new body, it's a not-for-profit, and we're trying actually to do something that's proved really difficult, which is to measure the financial, only financial, so in healthcare terms, we wouldn't be doing, you know, the impact on the quality of life for people who don't get operations. But it's an interesting point. We'll obviously have to do the retail sector. But we've got various categories. We don't have a taxonomy. We don't have a sort of Richter scale at the moment. We're trying to develop one. So it could be, on the vertical line, it could be the financial impact in the millions and billions, or it could be the number of operations affected. So we did a few dummy runs. The attack on the NHS in London, here in London last June, would have been a category 2 because it's just financial, so it's not the disaster in healthcare, because it cost quite a lot of money to the exchequer, but didn't affect that many organizations. We do accidents, cyber accidents as well. So CrowdStrike is also a sort of Cat 2, Cat 3 borderline because it affected huge numbers of organizations, but didn't actually cost many of them that much. So all of this really matters. What's the financial cost? What are you most worried about? Because this feeds, we have to get into the mind of those who are going to attack us. So those who are going to attack us, what is their objective? Do they just want cash or data to turn into cash, as a lot of them do? Or do they want to do propaganda, or is it political? This is really important. Do you think that people who are attacking you want to gather information covertly, either for commercial espionage or, you know, get a data set, or maybe it's politically sensitive, or do they want to wreck your network? So those are two completely different technical operations. They start the same way, but they diverge greatly. Because if I'm the attacker and I'm trying to get in and out to get a specific data set, then I'll do it one way. Sorry, there's a missing D in the and. Or if I'm spying or prepositioning, I'm going to try and stay there for as long as I can without being detected. So again, technically that's different. And if I'm trying to ransom the network, embarrass the network owner, so a criminal will do the first, a hacktivist will do the second, or if I'm trying to destroy as much as I can, do I want it as soon as possible, or do I want to hold it back for a specific occasion? We have to get into the attacker's mindset. And finally, do I care about getting caught? That's really important because some attackers really care about getting caught and some don't because they're operating under the protection of a state. And that will change the way they attack. And do I care about collateral damage? Are they going to really focus on me or are they going to be reckless? Am I going to, because from our defender's point of view, some of the things we're most vulnerable to are the reckless attackers, the people who just say, right, I'm going to send something and it's going to mutate all around the world, and that's where some of the biggest cyber operations have come from. So when we think about defenders and we think about, this is a sort of adapted version of the NIS framework, we have to assess our risk. We have to have perimeter defense. We have to, once the perimeter defense is breached, as it sometimes will be, we have to be able to detect it. We have to be able to mitigate it when we can detect it before we can kick it out. And crucially, we have to be able to recover. But I think we can't plan for that without assessing who's likely to get at us and why. Because in assessment and recovery, who wants to attack us and what do they want? And what do we care about? What matters most to us? And as the likes of Marks and Spencers are finding out, what would happen if that went down? How long would it take us to recover? How would we cope in the meantime? And then, in terms of perimeter defense and detection, this comes back to the, are you enriching uranium point? Well, what are the TTPs? What are the tools, the tradecraft of the most likely threat actors? If they're just lurking, can we detect them? If they're going for sort of destruction of the network, can we kick them out? Can we stop that? So that's a little bit about understanding the threat actors and understanding the harm. And I passionately hope that that sort of helps you think through the risk to you. So what harms are you worried about? Who realistically might be after you, and how would they do it? But then we move on to how we understand the sort of technology side of this. So we've been at this for a while now. The technology has been evolving but stable, but we're now in a new era where we're all doing new business processes and so forth, particularly around AI. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because one of the things I think it's most damaging one of the things that's been most damaging in cybersecurity has been hype. It's been this whole thing, oh, the threat's getting exponentially worse. Actually, the threat's quite nuanced. It's been high, but it's been relatively stable for a long time. There have been important changes, such as China and so forth. But if it was true that it was getting exponentially worse for years and years, we wouldn't be here. So that's sort of manifestly not true. And I think the industry was getting so much better at getting realistic about cyber harms. But now we're on a tipping point, potentially, where we're going to go into a new hype cycle where everybody will believe anything about AI security risk. So I wanted to talk about that for a bit and how we get a realistic approach to AI security. But just to give you a little example, it's actually pretty much exactly 2 years old. So I don't know if this would happen today, but 2 years ago, these headlines came up. Now the one on the right is the Times. Wales Online and Wyong, so two relatively small news outlets, are the only other ones apart from the Times who've had the decency to keep their original content up. So 2 years ago, there was a big scare for about 12 hours that the US had disclosed that during a military exercise by the US military, an AI drone had killed its human operator because the human was trying to stop it from carrying out its evil mission. And that went all over the world. So the Times have kept it up. Everybody else has changed their story. I was in Australia at the time. It was on the live news in Australia. I saw it in the Washington Post and so forth. For about 12 hours, a lot of us who specialize in trying to help organizations manage realistic cyber risk thought, good God, what's happened? We're wrong about everything. There's a real paradigm shift in the threat. Turns out, over the course of the next 12 hours after that, there were three what the communications professionals call clarifications to the story. The first one's my absolute favorite. We've added quote marks around kills and killed in the headline to emphasize that no actual human was killed in this simulation. As clarifications go, that's kind of an important one, I think. Clarification number two is not that interesting. The most interesting thing about it is the time it was issued. If you're issuing statements at 12:55 a.m., you're kind of in a lot of trouble and you sort of know it. It just says, the Air Force denied it had conducted a simulation. It's pretty categorical. And then the third one, at 7:30 a.m., so they've been up all night panicking about this, they said the speaker misspoke, and a simulated test where an AI drone killed a human operator was only a thought experiment. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because I would assert, and contradict me if you like, I don't mind being disagreed with, but I would assert that even in the wildest moments of COVID, where there are all sorts of wacko conspiracy theories all over the internet, the major news titles, the Times, the Washington Post, the ABC News in Australia, they never ran with any completely wacko stuff about COVID, but they ran with that without any critical judgment or whatever, because people will believe anything you like about AI. So I think we need to be really, really careful and forensic and specific when we're talking about AI and cyber risk. And to be fair to the British state, this is under the previous Sunak government, when it did its big AI summit in Bletchley 18 months ago, they released this paper in October 2023. And whilst, you've all got busy lives and presumably you place great value in your recreation time, I hesitate to recommend you should read a government paper, but it's actually quite interesting. It's the best analysis of AI risk I've seen. So it breaks it into three. Stuff that we might worry about just generally as citizens, not as cyber specialists, but there you go. So there's disinformation, there's bias, labor market disruption, that's all happening now. Then there's a mid-tier of cyber and bioweapons. Two kind of different problems, because the bioweapons, you can do really evil coding, but you have to get it into the physical world. Cyber, you don't. And then there's what the government euphemistically call loss of control, but that's like killer robots, et cetera, with minds of their own shooting people. And they say, look, you have to keep an eye out for that, but the risk of it's quite low. So we're going to specialize, obviously, in cyber. And this is me, not the government now talking. I think what we've had so far, we have events like this, we have jobs like ours, because in the internet age so far, we've had a load of harm, a load of real difficulty, but no real catastrophes in terms of mass casualty events, complete economic meltdown, and so forth. So it's been very sort of attritional and uneasy, but it's basically been an equilibrium. Why? Three reasons. One is we don't subcontract human safety by and large. Hospital administration is an exception. We don't completely subcontract human safety to computers. National Air Traffic Control System goes down in August 2023 in this country. Utter chaos, holidays, board meetings, missed weddings, and all of that. No planes can go anywhere. All the planes already in the air land absolutely fine. That's the difference between safety and security. The pilots know what to do. There are backup mechanisms that feel safe. Second one, think back to that grid. You want to steal some cash, you want to steal a bit of data, you can probably do it. Most people in this room probably know how to do it. You want to take out a power grid or an air traffic control system, it's really quite hard. You want to do a Stuxnet, it'll take you 5 years and $1 billion. So doing the most devastating things in cyberspace has tended to be the preserve of an elite few. And those people, however much we might dislike the Russian government and so forth, they're not going to just go nuts and just suddenly do an absolutely devastating cyber attack for no reason. And they'll be attuned to the political and potentially military consequences of doing something. And number three, this stuff has no morals, it's got no soul, it's just maths and engineering. So if you can code something for good, you can code it for, if you can code something for bad, you can code it for good. Does that hold in AI? So I think the first one should hold. One of the reasons we've been slow in driverless cars is we've wanted to get the safety model right that commands public confidence. That's a choice. If we want to subcontract human safety to computers, we can. I think we'd be nuts, but we could, or we shouldn't. So that should hope. This is the bit that worries me. Being a competent cyber actor is now a lot cheaper, and the tools are becoming a lot more available, and it's much easier to speed them up. AI doesn't give you magic new tools, but it gives you really, really fast ones, etc. And this one here, I put a sort of tick and a question mark, because, yeah, I mean, that principle doesn't change. If you can use AI-enabled cyber for bad, you can use it for good, but who's going to do it better? Vulnerability scanning is an absolute classic. The baddies will be doing AI-enabled vulnerability scanning at epic scale. Is our, for good, AI-aided vulnerability scanning going to be better than it? Because then we win. Is it going to be just as good? Because then we'll be uneasy. Or is it going to be worse, in which case we're in quite a lot of trouble. So we need to work at this, and that's really, really important. Looking at, for example, a combination of 2 and 3, I was in the US a fortnight ago, And I was given a demonstration of basically an AI social engineering and phishing engineered scheme. My American host said, "How did you get here? What airline did you use?" I said, "British Airways." "Do you have an account?" I said, "Yes." They typed in that. We started a stopwatch. 35 seconds later, this landed in my inbox. It's really good. The only flaw in it is weird COVID-era photograph, but that was 35 seconds, and they generated hundreds of others in the same sort of time scale. So this kind of stuff is what we need to be getting on top of. What can we do about this? I do think, and this is where we need to put pressure on vendors and big tech, some of the things we've been doing in IoT are actually really interesting. So this all dates from, you may remember in the dim and distant past, when half of the sort of titans of the internet, the Amazons, Twitter as was, back in 2016 went offline because of the attack on the DNS provider Dyn, and that was hijacking a load of CCTV cameras with the password 12345 that could not be changed because they didn't have the functionality to change the default password. That's now illegal under the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Act of 2022 and the regulations of 2023. We have suddenly found ways of making hardware more secure by design. Can we do the same with foundational AI? Can we do the same with software? So to pull this together and finish with a little bit on network architecture, it's vital that we understand the sort of actors that will be interested in us, the sort of ways they do their attacks, and the sort of harms that we think are the most damaging for our organization. It's vital that we then realistically map that on to the changing threat with AI. But then finally, do we actually understand what we're defending? Not just the equities, but the actual networks. There's some spectacularly bad examples at the minute. I would encourage you to read the US government's advisory published last December on the Salt Typhoon point, which is the big espionage attack on telecoms companies in the US. That's a diagram from it, but the takeaway is they just didn't understand how the architecture worked. They just didn't know. It was all really antiquated. Lots of it couldn't be secured, but nobody really knew how it worked, essentially. If you remember the Cloud Hopper epic scale industrial espionage operation by China exposed in 2019, that was sending the Melissa virus, date of birth the year 2000, to some executives in Japan who opened it. Then there's no network segmentation, so they used Quasar Rat, the remote access Trojan, for less than $1,000 US. All of a sudden, they're into the global networks of many of the major managed service providers and through them their clients, because nobody understood their network architecture, nobody had segmentation and so forth. But there are good examples. It helps when you're designing something new. Whatever you think of the UK smart meters, it's really, really hard to turn them off at scale because of the way they were designed by the Energy Department with the National Cybersecurity Centre. They've got all sorts of verification mechanisms, and basically, they've got all sorts of switch-off buttons, so you could do a little bit of damage in one area of the country, but to take out the whole thing nationally, you more or less have to be at war with us and using all your elite cyber capabilities in that one operation. So, get you back some time, because it says I have 1 minute and 46 seconds left here. Here are 3 takeaways. The understanding of the threat landscape you face and the likely techniques of the attacker are fundamental to planning cyber defenses. So make your own risk assessment and prioritize accordingly. I'd sort of add there, don't forget that data versus disruption trade-off. You may have a hugely sensitive data set. You will have obligations under data protection law. But what about actually going offline, which is happening more and more? New technologies bring new risks, but most of the stuff we're going to be talking about is not new. So bear that in mind and have the right balance. Don't allow our cyber defenses to go chasing the new sexy stuff, and beware some of the catastrophization hype about AI. And then finally, understand your network, because if someone else understands it better than you do, you're in trouble. So thank you for listening, and stay safe, and have a brilliant conference. Thank you for having me.
We have got time for a couple of questions, I think, Ciaran, if that's okay. Anyone would like to ask a question? We've got some roving
Fine
mics
by
in the
me.
room. First session of the day, people are a little bit nervous about putting their hand up. You got a mic?
Hiya.
My name is Jules Anderson from Adama. I'm keen to understand how your view of what's happening with sovereign states and how we are prepared to detect and respond at a national level. You mentioned the DCC and the SMICI and that sort of stuff. Do you think we have the adequate funds and resources to detect and respond?
Do you mean offensive response? Or?
Well, defensive response initially, and then obviously to counter.
Yeah, so I think, look, state capabilities are a really important part of this, and it's a lot better than it was. It'll never be as good as we'd like it to be because there's a billion different competing pressures on the public purse. I think one of the things that's quite irritating is that, think back to that sort of spectrum from, the sort of rubbishy, sort of poxy cyber criminals all the way through to the big state threats and the Chinese pre-positioning. You want the government to be focusing on that latter bit as much as they can. But I'm guessing, I don't know, I don't run it anymore, but places like the National Cybersecurity Centre and the National Crime Agency and other agencies of the state have been pulled left, right, and centre towards Marks and Spencer's, which is sort of, horrible though it is to put it, routine cyber criminality. I do think, something I haven't mentioned, in terms of that data versus disruption risk, for those in critical, strategically important companies, we're recognizing that huge amounts of public risk lie in private hands, energy, water, all that, universities, things like that. And so regulations are going to be tightened. I think if you tighten regulations, the quid pro quo is the state has to up its capabilities. You can't just say to people, right, you've got to do this, and then they have no support. So I think we're at a point where we're going to have to pick them up. I do think then, in terms of response, I think in terms of detection, it is pretty good. The GCHQ machine is excellent at that, but you want to focus it more on the top end of the threat. In terms of response, I think the government is in a more realistic place. I think in 2021, it sort of drank a bit of offensive cyber Kool-Aid and sounded like it had found some magical new invisible weapon that could do everything, and that's not the way cyber works. It's not the way it works technically. And also, like, if some Russian criminals hack a hospital here, what are we going to do in response? We can hack them, sure. We're not going to hack a Russian hospital. So there are limitations on what we can do. So, it's a moving journey. I think it's okay, but it's good, but needs to be focused in the right places, and it'll need to be increased because we're about to require the country as a whole to up its cyber defenses, so the state needs to do it too. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Anybody else? One over there? Come on, Enoch, you can go faster than that. Been beaten to it.
Hi, what is your opinion on the proposed legislation to make paying of ransomware illegal, and what impact do you think it'll have if it passes?
So, great question. I think the government's rhetoric on an actual outright ban has been pretty lukewarm, so there's a consultation out, and there are 3 different steps you can take. Number 1, which looks likely, I don't speak for the government, but the tone looks likely, is mandatory notification. I think that's very sensible. It's really hard to get a grip of a problem that you've got no idea what it is. And obviously, the thing you're least likely to know is people who pay and don't tell anybody. So, I think the mandatory notification, I don't see the case against it. I just don't. Right? The second one is getting a license to pay. So you have to apply. That's tricky territory. I wouldn't like to be in government making that judgment, if you like. And the third is an outright ban. And this goes back to my answer to the previous questioner, which is a great question, as is yours. So it goes back to Joseph's point. If you're going to ban ransom payments, I think you can and should do it. I think, for example, I'd love to get proper data on this, but anecdotally, it's pretty clear the National Health Service suffers far less disruptive ransomware attacks, suffers some, mostly through suppliers, but suffers far less than hospitals in the United States. And the reason, to me, looks pretty obvious, because the US ones pay, because they're private. But why can the state afford not to pay? The state can afford not to pay because the state has gargantuan resources and it can throw the kitchen sink at the problem for state bodies. Private companies can't do that, even the biggest ones. So if you're going to ban ransom payments, same answer. The state has to up its game somehow, whether that's some form of compulsory insurance scheme, whether it's expanded capabilities to help, because, like all laws, even if the long-term impact of it is good, there'll be some hard cases if you ban ransom payments. Somebody will go out of business. There'll be some crisis in a critical service, and people will be saying, as they did in Dublin in 2021, pay, just get out of trouble. We don't want to do this, but pay. You can't just ban and walk away. You have to have some element of support for those people that you're asking not to pay, that you're requiring under pain of a criminal or civil penalty not to pay. So that'd be my answer. I don't think actually they're going down that road. I do hope they just make a case one way or the other, because one of the things I think is a bit weird at the minute is we sanction people all the time. We sanction Russian oligarchs, we sanction rogue actors from individual states, and we sanction loads of cyber criminals. And if they're on a sanctions list, you're not allowed to pay them. So one of the weirdnesses of where we are right now is if you get a ransomware and you want to pay, it's your responsibility to check that you're not paying some group that's on the sanctions list. How are you supposed to do that, right? So we need to get out of that inadvertent halfway house and make a decision one way or the other, and I hope they do.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, if that's okay.
Right. Hi, Ciaran.
Oh, hello. Sorry.
Over here. It's Anne-Marie from Tech and...
Sorry, keep going. I just can't see where the question is.
Shall I stand up? No. Sorry, Anne-Marie from Tech Informed.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Thank you. There you
Over to you.
Sorry. Sorry, Anne-Marie.
You touched on it briefly, but I was wondering if you could run through lessons learned from the ransomware attack on Marks and Spencer's. And have you noticed any common patterns with the kind of attacks that have happened this year, whether it's in the retail sector or sort of across the board?
Sure. Firstly, apologies for some reason. I mean, literally a blind spot over the side of the room. Secondly, there are some very novel features of M&S. One is, secondly, let me caveat things. The government hasn't said much. I don't blame them for that. You say things at the right time. M&S haven't said, everything that they know. Again, don't blame them for that. So I have to caveat that this is speculative and not authoritative. What appears to be in the public domain, novel because it appears to be English-speaking and therefore possibly arrestable, which would be great. And then the social engineering aspect of it, the sort of, one can adduce, or one can sort of infer, maybe wrong, but that there was some sort of oral conversation with a help desk in perfect English that persuaded them to reset the password of privileged access users, and that's pretty unusual. So there are some novel features of this, and we've got to, one of them is positive, we might be able to catch them, the other is, just to add to the list of concerns, we need to be more careful about help desk reset procedures. But I think the lessons, the strategic lessons, a few. So one is, I think, the point about resilience and recovery. That's an obvious one. The second, I think, comes to the point about national vulnerability. When COVID happened, I was in government at the time, and across government, not just cyber, everything, we were looking at what do we need to keep this country running in this mad situation? And food was really interesting, the food sector, because obviously it's obviously critically important. No single company is critically important. But it turns out, if this is criminals, it wasn't that hard to take M&S quite badly offline. So a nation state at a time of conflict could do loads of them at once. And that worries me. And I think that's why the whole thing we're talking about public risk in private hands, that's why we need to incentivize people. Because again, it's now different with the co-op because the co-op had to take their own systems offline to repair the sort of data breach. But if you remember back to the first week of the sort of duo, M&S were clearly being disrupted, the shelves were emptying, and the co-op was just a data breach. And it wasn't that serious a data breach for the card holders because it was just, there's not very much information. A bit more serious for the 70,000 co-op staff with passwords and logins, particularly if they reuse passwords elsewhere, as everybody does. But it goes back to the point where you illustrate and you look at this and you think, which is worse in the retail sector, empty shelves or data breaches? And I'm going with the empty shelves from a strategic point of view. So it's about rethinking that balance about how and what we protect.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. Everyone, round of applause for Ciaran. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Brilliant.
everybody.